And if you're not out there using technology to validate your thinking or to determine the language choices that customers are using, then you're going to be in big trouble. And so having language analysis where you can get out and do things quickly is super, super important. And that's where relative insight has come in for us quite a bit in a variety of ways, which I'm going to walk through today. The one thing I would say that has changed dramatically in everything is that when it comes to PR, everything is data driven. We look at how we're validating the work we're doing, and PR has expanded dramatically as well. I mean, right now as an agency, we're bringing companies public on the New York Stock Exchange. We're looking at what's happening, what's the sentiment online with investors. We're looking at how do we make sure that the stories that we are telling are things that reporters actually care about and investors actually care about. And importantly, we are making sure that also employees feel validated and feel like they are part of this, the opportunity to tell those stories, and they feel that they're authentic. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of how we've been working with our clients in particular. I've cloaked these examples, but I think you're going to enjoy them. So we know that data science is where we're focusing a ton. And right now, I would say at our agency, we're using a number of different tools, but the human touch has not gone away. So I will highlight that our process is one that interviews people internally, externally. We are doing our own research, and then we bring in relative insight as part of the process of how we do our brand narrative lab here at Red Fan Communications. And we test that, and we want to make sure that what we're putting forward is something that's going to stick. So that's where the data science really helps us quite a bit these days. And I'm finding that when I go in and talk to clients and I say to them, hey, we're going to do this process, and most of our clients, it's not their first rodeo, right? If they're a CMO at a company or it's they're the CEO of a company, it's probably not their first time. Our clients are pretty evolved, but they love hearing that we have the opportunity to use AI and natural language, because when you're bringing people through an interviewing process, you are in fact leading them down a primrose path. And there is some, there is some, I would say, challenge with that at times. You're going to come to some conclusions, but at the same time, are they actually accurate? And so when you can go out and use natural language opportunities to test that, or look at a competitive analysis, or look at how, say, CFOs are talking about post-COVID analysis. Those things are things that you can't really do without a heavy lift. And when you have a partner like Relative Insight, you can do that a lot more effectively. What we're seeing right now when it comes to using data-driven PR kind of mindset with our clients is that we use our platforms to, including Relative Insight, we look at what are the trends, what are the linguistic and industry trends. So a lot of times clients have gotten very, very caught up in their own marketing language, but we want to go out and see what are the choices and the language choices that the customers are using, and how do we speak to them and look at their pain points and in their own language. Very often companies are like overshooting the trend, and it's fine to be a big thought leader, but if you're missing the mark and the real pain points for your customers because you're using language that they don't really connect with, then that's a problem. And you see this in SEO research as well. So when you start to combine those things across your platform, you can really get a good sense of linguistic trends. The other big one is, how do you position the client as an authority? And that was one of the topics that we absolutely have to look at very, very carefully. And so we're going to jump ahead here to the 3 ways we're looking at it. We're looking at discovery, validate, and relate. So we're using natural language and data to inform and understand the problems and business challenges and where the disconnects are between maybe internally, if we've done interviews with executives, and then externally, we've done interviews with customers, maybe their target customers are even higher area or a specific vertical. We want to see where are the disconnects so we can make sure we help them with their language choices and connect there, and also look at the competition and see what kind of, even the tone that they might be using on their website, as well as the stories they're telling. We're also looking at maybe we've come to a hypothesis around a brand after we've done all this research, and we're able now to kind of go out and use relative insight to validate or question where we've come in at. And then the target audience, we want to meet the target audiences where they are with that language, which I've already highlighted. We don't want to underestimate the stakeholders in the process, and make sure that we can validate that. So that's super, super important, and that it's relatable language for them. So one of our clients is a geopolitical analyst, and he had been in a large firm and was actually breaking out to start his own company completely from the ground up. And so we actually did a very interesting process here, where we found that the word geopolitics is misunderstood and used a lot of different ways. Also, geopolitical analysts kind of have an old school approach to how they do things, and how they present themselves. And we wanted him to really stand out. We were doing everything from building the brand, helping to name them, coming up with their actual positioning, their tone, and even the target kind of clients that they really wanted, sort of the DNA of that client. What did they look for in this type of analyst? And so we were able to use relative insight to look at the competitive brand voice, validate the research and methodology differentiation that we had worked on with the client. And also we went through and looked at all of the competing websites, and we were able to basically download all of the language off those sites and see what were the keywords that were being used. And also, were these competitors using first or third person in their copywriting? And we went with first person for our client as a result, to make them much more kind of high touch and put the human back into the work. I think we have a slide that actually shows a little bit of what I mean by that. What we found, a good example here, is what a slide might look like, and what one of them looked like as we looked at our client. Basically, it showed that most of these other competitors were using risk type language and fear mongering. And if you don't work with us, you're going to find yourself in deep trouble. And CEOs certainly will buy into that, but we wanted to stay away from that. And we found that our client wanted to does his best work and attracts his clients on the opposite side of this. Really, he's finding opportunities where CEOs are intelligent, they have got great teams, but they want someone who's going to come in and help them look at the risks from different angles, not tell them what to do, but give them sort of an option of, here's the different things that you might consider. And so we were able to take this type of information and make decisions about how to structure the brand for our geopolitical analyst and his team. Another great example, this was, we were looking at the words and choices that were being used and the tenses for this specific client. And what we found was we wanted to be much more high touch and in the first person. And this was also forward looking versus in the past. And by the way, that's even more important with COVID right now, because a lot of CEOs are usually would look at what was the historic behavior of the past. And we're also in an election year. And so we really needed to kind of factor different things in. So I would say that our client is a lot more kind of current in the way they're presenting themselves. The second example was an interesting one. This is actually a VC. So we have a client who's a VC, fantastic company, working in the SaaS space. And the challenge is that we really wanted to kind of carve out their own space. And of course, when we did our interviews internally and externally, we heard some really interesting things about them being operator-led. But we started looking at the competition. So we did the one-on-one interviews, that was fine. And then we evaluated competitors using Relative Insights platform. And when we started to look at the AI natural language analysis, it started to reveal some really interesting things about the competition. It was actually kind of disturbing to look at how VCs are presenting themselves on their websites. We sucked all the language off the competitor websites. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that we started to see some interesting trends. We wanted to look at these companies, but we also looked at the way our client was talking about themselves when they go out to talk to their portfolio companies, and the way portfolio companies are talking about them. And we realized that there was a big disconnect. They weren't actually walking the walk in their own. So this is comparing them against how they describe themselves, and they were not using their own language. They talk about modern business model. They talk about the network effect. They talk about the ecosystem they're able to create for their portfolio companies. And none of that was actually showing up. If you can see the numbers, that was not showing up for them on their platforms, their social media, their website. And so by working with Relative Insight, we were able to show them that there was a massive disconnect and an opportunity to get their presentation of themselves to be a lot more authentic and in line with how people view them. And this was also true. One of the things we looked at was value language. A lot of the competitors, which we're not going to show all those slides, but they talked a lot about fear, doubt, and uncertainty. I call it like 60 minutes on Sunday night. Like, if you don't work with us, you're going to die a poor man. That was kind of the language we were seeing on a lot of the other VC sites that work in the same space as our client. We wanted to look at value language. What is the value we are bringing to the portfolio companies? And we started to look at the language that was being used in the interviews internally and externally, and how that was or wasn't being used in the platforms. And we started to show them that those things were not coming through. And so it gave us the opportunity to demonstrate the need to start to look at this language and making sure it's woven through all the things that they're doing and coming to life through case studies. The third example is a doozy. I mean, the supply chain space is absolutely packed. I think even the customers of supply chain software companies are confused when they get out there on their journey to kind of figure out where they should go. And we found that in doing a massive positioning workshop with our client, it was also equally important, as it always is, to make sure that the sales team is involved in this as well. Because if you build out a platform, a narrative, and it doesn't get embraced by the sales team, you're going to find yourself in a world of pain. It's just going to be rejected. And so what we did was we confirmed the top-down positioning that ties supply chain performance to revenue. We were able to use Relative Insight to validate actually the core value proposition to the brand by getting out there and doing sort of analysis on the competitive sites. And then we're able to use the AI tool to actually look at the language analysis around thought leadership, sales, and media relations programs, and also build out a platform that's going to allow us to bring the CEO of this company forward in a really compelling way, with storylines that are not being told out there in the media, and with language choices that are a lot more effective than the gobbledygook that is often used in this space. Just making sure you all can hear me. But these are two good examples. We looked at revenue impact, and in fact, it's more likely to discuss supply chain impact on revenue. This is super, super important. One of the things during COVID is that it's a lot easier for companies to say, I'm not going to go with the supply chain software. I can't, it's a nice to have. And that's what sales teams are hearing all over the place around all sorts of tools right now. So what we found was, if we could talk about the revenue impact and really connect that and show the risk to revenue, and how to gain control over that, it was really, really important. So this was a real competitive advantage that we were not seeing other companies use at all in this space. And then also the ERP integration, which this was a core value proposition, and it was important, and we were able to look and see that it wasn't being used. And you can see differences on the left. The way that Relative Insight presents this is something that you have to work with Relative Insight. but their team is incredible. And once you understand what this means, these little keys on the left, you are able to really see pretty quickly where the white space is for your client to tell a unique story and how to present things in a very different way compared to the competition. So when it comes to positioning, as I was saying, it's important once we get to that nirvana where you actually are able to tell a narrative and put that storyline together and then build a platform for the executives at a company, you want to make sure you socialize it both internally and externally. We've all seen companies who run out and start getting press and they don't even bother telling their employees about press releases going out. It's the same thing with messaging. You absolutely have to get it back and make sure that it sticks. Too often in the past, when it came to positioning language and brand language, as I explored earlier, people would come in, it was like pulling a rabbit out of a hat and everyone was supposed to have an aha moment. But if you weren't part of the process and it didn't get socialized with you and you didn't get to really feel like it was part of the DNA of the company or it didn't feel authentic, then often positioning language and brand activities would get rejected. So making sure it's socialized, making sure that it's activated through HR, through the website, through your social media, through your PR, through your nonprofit work, and then reassessing. So Relative Insight is a great example where we're able to go back and look and say, okay, let's look at using Relative Insight, say 9 months after a campaign to see, are the language choices that we have put forward, are they starting to really stick, and are they actually being used consistently around across the platform, internally and externally? It's a great way to be able to go back and measure. So I appreciate your time. I hope this was helpful, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. That was brilliant. I've just got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. So the first question I have for you is so when does a company need to do their narrative and development, and how often does that happen, basically?
I would find that too often it happens after companies have already put a lot of time in. So I would say the perfect time is to do it before you're going to redo a website or launch a product, and it can be after a client has already started, they've kind of got up and going, and their sales team has gotten out there and gotten some feedback, and they're starting to realize we've gotten some feedback now. It's time to get, you need to get things moving a little bit further. You can do it at the very, very beginning of launching a company, but then you would probably need to go back and validate about 6 to 9 months into it once your sales team has started to get that feedback. And then the other time is there's plenty of companies that are out there that have, even universities that maybe have been living and dying on positioning that is now maybe stale. And often it's big moments like election years, COVID, that make companies start to realize, wait a second, we need to change things. And I think that sales teams, when they start to squeak and they're not getting where they need to be, that's a really good time to stop and reposition and assess what's going on, because brand positioning is not just window dressing. It absolutely should be working with the sales team all the way through. Otherwise, it's kind of a waste. It's just like putting nice paint on a house. So you absolutely have to make sure that the sales team has what they need. And that's when if there's any question about them not being able to get where they need to be, it's time to stop and invest in this.
Makes sense. Okay, thank you. And what are you've spoken about some of them, but what are the steps for defining a narrative for a company, and how do you normally test it, and how long does it take?
So what we do, Will, is we actually have a process that we go through, and it's basically we customize an interviewing process internally with stakeholders. We make sure that those individuals go through that process, and this is about a 6-week process in total. What we do is we go through and we expect them to be readily available. These are all anonymous interviews. Then we also expect to interview a select number of customers and partners externally. We then do a full competitive analysis of the language choices of the competitors that those individuals have brought forth. And then we also do a workshop after that, and we come forward with what our findings are. And that's where we get the client very actively involved versus the old way of pulling, you know, a rabbit out of a hat and saying, here you are. They're part of that process, and then we're able to go back and fine tune that and bring it forward. And then we work on socializing it, and we actually have the CEO send notes out to the partners externally that have been interviewed, and also make sure that it's presented internally as well. So it's fully socialized.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's very
You're
comprehensive. So thank you so much, Kathleen. I'm conscious of time, so I'm gonna move ahead to the next sections. But thank you very much, and I'm sure there'll be questions from the floor at the end of the session as well.
Okay.
Perfect. So just moving on, the next theme that the next topic we're gonna talk about is we're going to talk about two brands. They're quite specific. I said at the beginning that challenger brands come in all shapes and sizes, and that's the case in the UK grocery market with Aldi and Lidl. So just to set the scene for our international friends, for anyone who's not familiar with the UK grocery market, we've got four big supermarket chains here. We've got Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrison's. And just to give you an idea, these four guys are the equivalent of, you know, your Walmart, Kroger, or Safeway in the US. And then we have Aldi and Lidl, and Aldi and Lidl have actually been trading in the UK since 1990. But it feels like it's only been in the last 5-6 years that they've really started making a serious dent in our grocery market. Aldi and Lidl have really been like supermarket superstars over the last few years. They're shaking the industry. They used to be called quite pejoratively the discounters, but not anymore. Just to give you an idea, this is how us Brits viewed shopping at Aldi or Lidl a few years ago. I saw this headline in a website that made me chuckle. Is Poynton, which is a town too posh for an Aldi. And you know, it was a lot of people who were going in Aldi and Lidl with Waitrose or Whole Foods bags, and you know, pretending that they don't shop there because it might be badly seen by their friends and family. But actually now, you'd be quite proud to brandish an Aldi bag in Whole Foods. You know, and if you purchase Lidl's cheap champagne equivalent, you'll be hailed as a savvy financial hero and no longer, you know, a penny pincher. So we've really seen that shift in data as well. So let's have a look at the data behind this. So just to give you a bit of context, what we've done is that we've looked at social media to start with, so social media data, and we compared that data over time. Basically, you'll see that Relative Insight complements the social listening platforms really well. The social listening platforms are great at collecting data, but they're not so good at analyzing it. So by using Relative's comparison methodology, what we do is less searching and more discovering. So you simply upload the data, and through the process of comparison, which I talked about, you will uncover what we call unknown unknowns. So it's more of a process of discovery rather than search. And actually, when we do this process and when we start comparing the social data over time, what we've seen is that since 2018, shoppers are much less likely to judge people for shopping at Aldi and Lidl. Before 2018, what we saw was that actually there were quite a lot of pejorative terms associated with Aldi and Lidl in conversation. So, you know, like middle class, loads of class related words, poor people, and that is still happening. However, it is happening much less. So you can see that previous to 2018, it was about 5 times more likely to appear in conversations compared to nowadays. And the second thing that we thought was interesting to highlight was the fact that now, really since 2018, Aldi and Lidl are much less likely to be mentioned together. They are seen as, you know, completely separate entities, and they each have their own strengths and weaknesses. So they're no longer just grouped in as Aldi and Lidl, like I'm doing through this presentation, and they're no longer just branded as the discounters. You know, they each have, as I said, their own strengths and weaknesses. So moving on, why are they so successful? What makes them so successful? So what we've done now is that we've moved away from a time comparison, and instead of using Relative Insights platform to compare over time, what we've done is a branded comparison. So we looked at conversations on Aldi and Lidl, and we compared it to conversations on what we call the big four, the established supermarkets, which are the 4 supermarkets I highlighted earlier. A key factor in Aldi and Lidl's success is their social media presence and the way they leverage platforms such as Twitter to their advantage by, you know, completely mirroring their customers' language. So the first factor that contributes towards their success is that they're actually, you know, very simply much more likely to make jokes. Actually, when we compare them to the established supermarkets, they're about 40 times more likely to make jokes on social media compared to those established supermarkets. You can see some of those jokes here. So yes, that's a key factor for their success. Secondly, making jokes also includes making jokes about themselves. Both Aldi and Lidl, for a bit of context, have a middle aisle that offers a completely random selection of products at a very discounted price. And, you know, I'm not talking food products. I'm talking completely random, like dog beds, indoor security cameras, screen projectors. These items change on a I don't know, like not a daily basis, but a weekly basis. And they're items that are bought at a very cheap price by Aldi and Lidl from companies that have excess stock. And people absolutely love that because, you know, it makes them go to Aldi and Lidl more often. But they also love it and joke about it because it's so random. And, you know, if there's one thing that us Brits love is being able to make fun of ourselves. So really what Aldi and Lidl have done is that they've taken that joke and they've seen that their customers are joking about the middle aisle, not always in a good way, but they've really used that to their advantage and leverage that joke to use it in their own communication. And that's proving really, really effective. Thirdly, they are much more clever in their use of emojis. You know, as we all know, emojis, you know, it's a language to itself now. Actually, it's about 20%, 1 in 5 tweets contains at least one emoji. And that figure just keeps on growing year after year. And, you know, Aldi and Lidl have clearly seen that. And they're, again, mirroring the way, you know, people talk online and how people talk nowadays to their advantage. And they're really mirroring that in their daily communications. And then finally, they're also much more likely to talk about how their customers feel and how they've been dealing with the pandemic rather than about themselves. And they've done that, for example, with the lockdown life hashtag. The difference here is that established supermarkets don't really do that. They're much more self-focused. They're much more likely to talk about things that they have done themselves. Whereas Aldi and Lidl don't really talk about things they're doing. Obviously, they do to some extent to reassure the public, but a lot of the time, actually, they talk about, you know, completely different things. We'll use memes and GIFs in order to relate with their audience, basically. So that's a short tale of you know, on Aldi and Lidl's success here in the UK, all through language comparison and discovery. We didn't really search for any specific answers. Actually, we didn't search for any answers at all. We simply pulled out the data from social media and we let the tool show us the key differences in the language these supermarkets use. So that we've seen that Aldi and Lidl are very good at adapting their own language, their own communications based on how their customers talk. And that's really important in order to be successful nowadays. So I'm going to now pass on to Evan, who's going to play a game of rock, paper, scissors in some sort. So to you, Evan.
Fantastic. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Kathleen. Amazing words of wisdom this morning. It's always fascinating to hear what relative insight can uncover. I'm Evan Faber, CEO and Chief Strategist of Moxie Sozo. We are based in Colorado, a branding agency. We've been around for 21 years, focusing mainly in the CPG space. And so as an English major, I love language. So today we're going to look at some of the dynamic forces that shape branding and in a model called rock, paper, scissors, and branding. So without further ado, we'll dive in because I want to catch us up on some time here. So before we get started, first a note about giants. I know this presentation is giant killers. We work with a few giants and we work with a lot of startups. And I'm remembering the myth of Orion. Orion was this giant, this hunter, amazingly powerful, but blind, and had a servant who was tiny, who would sit on his shoulder and tell him where to go. And I think there's another metaphor here besides just the slaying of the giants, is how companies can work together, how the giants can learn the nimbleness and perspective and agility from the tiny guys, and the tiny guys and gals can uncover the brilliance and the fortitude and how to weather the storms from the giants. So there can be a little less polarization and a little more unity. Just wanted to share that message right out of the gate. But now getting into the start of this on the next slide. So branding is the art and science of teaching a brand how to be human. And it's always revelatory. Wait, I can have a sense of humor as a supermarket and people will relate to me? Yes, please be human is the message I think a lot of strategists want to shout at the brands. Yeah, use your heart and soul. And Will, it's a good cautionary tale about emojis. I think we can look back to ancient Egypt to see how emojis disrupted their language and became hieroglyphics. And I think we're moving into the same thing where we'll have hieroglyphics 2.0, where it will just be emojis. And then, it'll be interesting to see how relative insight evolves. And Kathleen loved the idea of natural language that came out, but both those ideas speak to the humanity in branding that brands need so much, because as rational as we think we are, we tend to be a little more irrational than rational. We tend to make decisions with our heart and justify with our mind, even when we have the best intention when we're shopping or making decisions. So brands have to hit functionally and emotionally. So a little prelude now, just a couple quick slides about language. One of the most consequential things humans learn, if branding is the art of teaching a brand how to be human, well, one of the first things we teach humans is language. Language shapes everything from how we dress to who we love and what we think is possible, because language shapes culture. Language has the power to unite people, your audiences, who seemingly have nothing in common, into your community. Language tells me if you're part of my community or not, hence the importance of something like natural language. Basic, lit, ghosting, banger, dead ass, fire, and facts, glow up, finsta, I'm dead. That is a language being spoken right now. Are you still with me? If you want a brand to connect to consumers, you have to speak their language. And in some circumstances, you have to teach them yours. Now, just as people grow up, so do brands, and language helps achieve goals along the way. So let's take a look at a couple examples. When we're young, whether we're a human or a brand trying to be human, we've got an unwavering need for attention. Mom, 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 or mom, mom, mom. See, I'm bilingual there. When we're older, we need the energy and support to thrive. And in our golden years, we still have the desire to be connected, as do mature brands. Brands follow a similar life cycle to humans and use language in similar ways to grow. So let's take a look a little bit more at this example. This concept, rock, paper, scissors, is from Marty Neumeier, who's a wonderful author on branding. And he says there are three types of brands, three types of companies. You have these scissor brands, rock brands, and paper brands. Now, scissor brands jump in and they cut into the market. They cut into the established market because they're small, they're nimble, they got a sharp idea, and they've got that early, just upstart energy. If they stick around long enough, they eventually will turn into rock brands. Now, rock brands can crush scissor brands because they formerly were. Now they're growing and they've got momentum on their side. And the rock brand's strength is the momentum that they have. So they need to keep that momentum at all costs. And if they do that, they turn into paper brands. Paper brands are the brands that have hit the economies of scale. They're massive. They can suppress the rock brands, slow their momentum, and they've just dominate market share and market forces, but they're not very nimble. And so the upstart brands cut into them along the way. And so this kind of cycle repeats. And it's just an eloquent way to sort of assess, regardless of your company's size and age, how is it behaving right now? And what does it need to do to continue its growth from a high level? So we'll take a look at three brands and how we used relative insight to uncover opportunities for these brands. And the first brand is a scissor brand, and scissor brands need salience. My cat is joining us. I don't know if you can hear the musings of him, but I'll be providing the backdrop for some of this. So scissor brands, the small upstart brands, need salience, they need awareness. And so what we look at here is finding the right tone to be heard. Young brands need to learn the right tone. You can't just throw tantrums to get what you want. We try that in those supermarkets, and we quickly learn that's not going to work. So we have to understand our audience's preferred tone. So here is one example. So a lesson from an angsty upstart. So here we go, a scissor brand trying to make space, trying to cut into the category. And this is interesting because it's actually the opposite of what Kathleen's examples were about earlier today. So this brand is in the natural product space, was looking to stand out from the competition. And the brand was using very negative language. I was surprised when we ran it through Relative Insight that it came back with words like violent and angry and damaging and destroy. Like, wow, that is certainly sending a wake-up call. Meanwhile, on the other side of the spectrum, you have all the competition that's promising sunshine and rainbows and the happiest world of your dreams and such empowering language. Unleash your full potential, live your life, buy our product. And so, it was just on the other end of the spectrum there. And so we were able to look at a couple things. And on the next slide, finding that sweet spot. So we saw that the brand was not resonating with consumers. It was out of alignment with their tone that they thought they were espousing and how consumers were wanting to be spoken to. Meanwhile, the category was speaking a language of empowerment, promising butterflies and rainbows, and the audience needed guidance and looking for benefits, not attributes. And so the sweet spot was tough love for this brand, that we weren't going to promise sunshine and rainbows. We were going to show up in an authentic way. We were going to play the role of the coach. We were going to be there to call you out, but also lift you up. And that was the goal of finding salience for this brand, this scissor brand that was looking to cut into the category. So as scissor brands need salience, momentum, rock brands need to be able to roll up. Rock brands need to be able to roll up. And so taking a look at one example, you gain that momentum, you've captured the hearts and minds of consumers initially. So how can you review and optimize your messaging at this point to make sure that you continue to grow? As people and brands grow up, grades become more important. Identify how consumers are reviewing you to learn more, how to keep your brand's momentum going. So this is one tactic of how to do it. And we're using relative insight to look at reviews of, here we are in the consumer electronics space. This brand was looking to grow its current audience without losing its core. And when we looked at the reviews of the competition and this brand, one thing was evident, that the other brands, the language was all about transaction and sale and product. And with this brand, they knew people's names. It was very personal. They felt something. And so leaning into the personal touch was going to help the brands capture what made them special to begin with and lean into it to help get that momentum to help them scale even further. So the brand insight was that people found it expensive but personal. The category was being cheaper but transactional. And the audience was overwhelmed by the category and needing a helping hand. So just here's a product isn't the solution. So the goal of this brand to keep the momentum and grow was to have them in all of their communication touch points, from operations to communications. And I love that Kathleen brought in that idea of socializing, because brand strategy, take brand away. Strategy is strategy, and it should inform the opportunities that companies go after, how they execute those opportunities, and yes, how they communicate in the market. And so the sweet spot here was scale the personal touch throughout your entire business. And last, we'll talk about the relevancy. Paper brands need pertinence. So salience for scissor brands, roll for the rock, and pertinence for paper brands. Well, back in my day might be irrelevant. What once was important might not be anymore. Not every brand story is worth telling for legacy brands. Things change, and unfortunately, you get brand inertia that is built up over the years in a lot of these big companies. And what is important to the brand is no longer important to the consumer. And the only reason it's still around is because the brand thinks it's important for themselves. And so here we are diving in. We're looking at a legacy brand that was blinding people with science. Having once created the category, the brand was now fighting to stay relevant. And so the brand was coming across as much more technical, using such attractive language as eggshell membrane and hydronized bovine, just to attract people. The competition was way more approachable. They were using food terms, sensory terms. Meeting people where they are was the phrase that we also love to use, but being human. And so, okay, so what do we do with that? So the brand was being much more technical. The category was approachable but lacked depth, and the audience was looking for easy solutions. So it's okay to have the technical verbiage, but package it within the benefit. So the sweet spot here was focus on the consumer benefits, give them the guidance they need, and reassure them with some of that technical information. So you may know that language is more than what you say, it's how you say it, but they actually quantified it. So as we're wrapping up, I wanted to share with you a couple more just quick points. Number one, brands use language to create meaningful connections with consumers by stimulating the intellect and stirring the soul. 55% of our communication is nonverbal, so it's how your brand is looking and feeling in the market. 38% is tone of voice, which is to say people don't always remember what you say. They remember how your brand makes them feel. And that leaves 7% for the actual content. So as important as content is, how it comes across, the tone of voice, the syntax, the grammar, all the things that Relative Insight can help uncover provides that authenticity to how you're saying. And remember, it's important to both stimulate the intellect and stir the soul as we're looking to make human connections with consumers in the market. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Evan. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I've got a question for you. So could you just briefly explain like what is Moxie Sozo's expertise before we go into like specific questions maybe about the presentation towards the end of the session?
Sure, yeah. Moxie Sozo, the term is unusual, the name's unusual. Moxie means courageous, it means bold, but an archaic definition means force of character, which I like the best. Getting into the unique, ownable character of a brand that only exists within that particular DNA of the company, and then expressing that in a bold way. That's Moxie. And Sozo is Japanese for intelligence and creativity. We are known for art in branding because we believe there's no more powerful force than art to create meaningful change for people. There's nothing like an amazing song that goes right past our defenses, can change our heart, change our life. Great brands should aspire to be works of art because works of art are things people pay a premium for, things that change their behavior and things that people want to share. So we lean into the power of art backed by data, of course, but art as a driving force to prompt change and grow businesses.
Thank you, Evan. I've actually seen there's a few questions popping up for you as well. I'm going to save them for the end. I'm just going to go through the final few slides and then it will be question time. So thanks again, Evan. To conclude, I'm just going to take you through a smaller use case and we're going to talk about subscription boxes. Subscription boxes are the new craze at the moment. But first of all, what do we actually mean by subscription boxes? So what we mean by subscription boxes is basically this. So from snacking boxes to plant boxes, dishwasher and laundry, there's tea and coffee and food, etc., even cat litter, makeup and beauty, of course, razors, beers, etc. So there's loads of them. They're basically everyday items that you might not think twice about in a supermarket aisle, but now they've been made exciting and delivered to your door. And they've obviously benefited massively from the rise of online shopping, especially here in the UK. Actually, when it comes to percentage of sales that go through online, the UK is by far the biggest European market, and it's actually the third biggest market in the world after China and South Korea. And COVID obviously has been a bit of a blessing in disguise for these brands because it's been a huge boost for them. So while other companies, have had to adapt very quickly and have had to scramble to, build online platforms sometimes, these guys had the whole supply chain already set up. And they were ready to welcome people who were just flocking to online during the pandemic. Some of these brands are disrupting really established markets, and it's the case of Sohler, for example. I came across this brand quite randomly. It was on my social media feed, I think, and they're a company who very simply sell dishwasher and laundry tablets. The difference is that they deliver them to your door every few weeks so that you don't even have to think about refilling from the supermarket. You just manage your subscription online. And so we decided to compare what people say about this brand, Sohler, versus what they say about Fairy in the laundry tablets market. Fairy is a well-known brand in the UK, and I think in the US and even globally it's called Dawn. So it's a big brand, just named differently in different markets. So what we did is that we looked at thousands of reviews for both brands, Sohler and Fairy, and we compared them to each other. And this is just some top line insights on what we found. So the first thing is that, Sohler clearly uses a lot of environmentally friendly language. So like words like recyclable, environmentally are all coming up much more often compared to Fairy. And, they're much more likely to come up in reviews. So they're clearly tapping into a massive trend at the moment, which is sustainability. And that's coming through in the reviews. Secondly, they also have a low price, and that's obviously important, especially us Brits, we like cheap things, so having a low price is important. So this notion of value, great value price, the overall topic of cost and money just comes up a lot more often, and is much more prevalent in reviews for small versus fairy. And finally, another massive consumer trend at the moment is convenience, ease, and that's coming through in small reviews as well. When we look at small reviews and we compare them to fairy, we're much more likely to see words associated with the overall topic of easy, which means that they're doing a very good job at tapping into that convenience trend. But if we just park aside small for a second, we also wanted to look at how people talk about subscription boxes in general. And so what we did is that we grabbed some data from different forums across the world, and we looked at what people were talking about when it comes to subscription boxes. And what we noticed is that subscription boxes were twice as likely to be talked about as gifts before 2018, but now they're talked about in a more personal way. They are actually, for personal uses, not just for gifts. And that's why people are now associating words such as, exciting or and anticipation, and the whole topic of excitement is just coming up a lot more in the latest years than it was before 2018. And understandably, that puts a lot of pressure on the content of the boxes. So we've seen language around disappointing and just disappointment in general over two times more likely to come up in the latest year compared to previous years. And actually, what we thought was really interesting, and this is just to conclude before we jump onto the questions, but when we look at Twitter and when we look at language relating to subscription boxes on Twitter, what we've seen is that it's actually very, very similar to what we've seen with Aldi and Lidl earlier. So by carefully analyzing how their customers' language, but also their customers' needs evolve over time, these brands are able to engage their audiences and stay relevant in a really smart way. So that's it from us. Thank you very much for listening. We've got time for some questions, and I'm sure there's loads. So let me just pull up the Q&A. Here we go. Wow, perfect. Loads. Let me just read very quickly through them. I've got a lot of praise for Evan and Kathleen. You were fabulous, apparently. So that's the first thing I'm reading. Yeah. So because we started a bit late, we'll have 5 minutes of questions. So hopefully that's all right for everyone. So the first one is a question for Evan. What tactics do you employ for breaking up the brand inertia without alienating stakeholders, particularly those that have been a big part building the company to that point?
Totally. It's something we deal with. We do a lot of brand refreshes. So company has been around for quite some time and has achieved sometimes monumental success. And so it's definitely something we come into contact with. And it's also something Kathleen talked about, which is that importance of socializing, not just selling in an idea, but bringing people along in the process is an important thing. And especially at key milestones, understanding and through stakeholder interviews, reaching out to those key people, understanding what's at the heart of their resistance to the change, what's the most meaningful things for those people as the brand moves forward. Just as we would take external consumers along, we want to take our internal audience along as well. And so understanding what their needs and emotional benefits are, we can craft a brand that can accomplish can meet people where they are internally and take them to where we need them to go. One tactic to that strategy I try and say all the time is when working with a bureaucracy or trying to get change pushed through, that it's not always about saying what you want to say, it's about hearing what you want to hear. And so sometimes it's asking the right questions to get to that answer. That Socratic method can be extremely powerful to help move change without telling people or directing people, but having it come from themselves, from their own internal motivations.
Thanks, Evan. And we've got a quite similar question for you, Kathleen. I've got a question here that says, for clients who might be skeptical about the data-driven approach or stuck in their old ways, how do you help them see the light when it comes to shifting their approach? So that's for you, Kathleen.
Well, I think it depends on the client, but you know, money speaks, money talks, right? So if the exercise can, if you can use something like relative insight to demonstrate the kind of chatter that's happening with their competitor brands versus their brand, they start to realize that maybe they're neglecting or leaving things behind. And so, and I also see this as a very important tool for even opening up conversations for new business. So if you're going in to win a piece of new business and you want to take the time to invest to open up a conversation, because I find that the best conversations with clients have data where you can just show the facts. When you show the facts and it's not emotional, it's not something I'm just feeling or thinking. I actually have data to put in front of them. It changes the conversation pretty quickly, Will.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kathleen. I know that there's a few, there was maybe a few technical questions that are more directly related to the tool. So I'm just going to go through one more, I think coming from Heli. I don't know if I'm butchering your name. I'm really sorry if I am. But the question is, what size of data is needed to effectively use relative insight as an insight tool? Are there some minimum numbers of words, data sets, etc.? So that's probably for me to answer. So we usually say that you need a minimum of 1,000 words in each side of the comparison. So a side of a comparison, we call that a language set. So if you think about comparing A and B, A should be 1,000 words minimum and B should be 1,000 words minimum. It just depends on what you're looking at, but that's usually a approximate figure that we give to our clients. So I hope that answers your question. I'm just going through the rest. I think that's most of it. There's a lot of talk on the chat, so thank you very much for your engagement. So I'm just trying to flick through the questions, but because we're running a bit late, I'm gonna conclude it here. Thank you so much for joining us, Kathleen and Evan. That was great. I'll let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon or the rest of your day, since you're both based in America. And thank you to all our audience. And yeah, please do get in touch if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you all.
It was a pleasure.